Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the third conference organized by Executive MBA of the University of Texas at Arlington and the MBA Weekend Santiago of the Faculty of Economics and Business of the University of Chile. We are very glad with the audience and the success of these conferences. Recently, we had the conference of Professor Jose de Gregorio, who spoke about economic effects of COVID-19 in Latin America. Now, I have the honor to introduce Professor Fernando Jaramillo, who will do a speech of the influence tactics to salesperson performance in COVID-19 context. Professor Jaramillo is Associate Dean for Students and Programs from the University of Texas at Arlington and is a PhD in Business Administration of the University of South Florida. We also remember him for his participation in the international weeks that we do in our graduate school for doctoral, MBA, and master students. And also, Fernando is a very good friend for us. Before starting the conference, I remind you that you can ask your questions through the chat. I leave Fernando with you and enjoy his presentation. Hello, dear Fernando.
Thank you, Leslie, for your warm introduction. And it's an honor for me to give this talk to our own EMBA students and to the students of Universidad de Chile. Welcome. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas. So, for the last 18 years or so, I have been working on sales research. That's what my area of research. And I started working in sales because I was looking at data, distribution of performance of salespeople. The figure that you have there in front of you on that PowerPoint reflects what I'm going to talk about. So typically when you approach, basically any mid-size or large organization, you will find a distribution of how salespeople perform on their jobs. And typically what you find is that if you compare those who are doing very well, that are selling at the very high numbers and meeting their sales quotas and exceeding their sales quota, with those who are not doing very well, the differences are substantial. Typically those differences are 3-to-1, 4-to-1, or even more when you have sales situations like direct selling. So what you have in front of you is real data of direct selling. So on these years, I have been working on trying to figure out, how do you differentiate these top performing salespeople from those who are not doing very well? And for all of the participants, if you have any question, feel free to pose that question on the chat. So can I have my second slide? So the first question I want to ask you all is, are top salespeople born or are they made? In other words, do they have innate characteristics that you cannot change? Or, are they made? So what do you all think? Actually, most of the variance is explained by the made factor, but there is a very strong component on the born factor as well. Like for instance, if you correlate, if you try to see what are the best predictors of performance of sales people, one of the best predictors is actually how tall a person is, particularly when they're males. So I'm probably very close to 5 feet. So I don't know why I'm doing sales kind of research, but one of the things that you will find is that some of the characteristics are personality-like, and things like how tall you are or how attractive people perceive you. However, most of the variance is made. Okay? Can I have my next slide, please? So I'm going to work on two topics today. The first one relates to perceptions of salespeople and trends in sales. And then I'm going to talk about persuasion and presentation. And what are some of the success factors? In other words, how do you want to persuade your customers so that they can buy more from you? Can I have my next slide? Okay. So first, let's talk about how customers typically perceive salespeople. Okay. When you ask customers, from the top of your head, tell me, what words come to mind when you hear the word salesperson. And as you see in this slide, the attributes are typically not very positive. They tend to be negative. So why do you think that is happening? What is the typical stereotype of a salesperson? Or, think about the experience that you have had with salespeople. Some of these experiences, I hope, are positive, but you will also see that there is a significant number of experiences that might not be positive, that are were probably not very professional and somewhat negative. So when you approach a customer, even if that customer or a prospect smiles at you, so forth and so on, back in his mind or her mind, that prospect is thinking, okay, here comes the salesperson. Okay? I need to watch for my wallet, and they're trying to do anything to try to sell me, so I must be careful. Okay? So the default reaction from customers is typically negative. So in terms of persuasion, we have to, number one, acknowledge that, and number two, try to overcome that first negative reaction that customers typically have when they know that you're a salesperson. Next slide, please. Can I have my next slide? When companies sometimes train salespeople, the models that they use are, they learn some techniques that try to apply pressure to the customer. So there are many interesting movies about that. So for instance, in the slide that you see there, how many times have you been told that the number one characteristic of high-performing salespeople is that they focus on close the deal, bring me the money. Spend most of your effort in trying to persuade the customer to buy. That is the advice sometimes that we give our salespeople. No wonder the results are not necessarily positive. So the first takeaway from this presentation, if you think about the sales funnel, the stages in the sales process, one of the least relevant is actually closing. So closing, when you put more effort in closing, customers actually react in a very negative way, especially when they're B2B. Sometimes when you employ these scripted sales techniques, as Jennifer says, you might get a client that is not very knowledgeable or not sophisticated to buy from you because they're balancing out the pain of listening to you or giving you the $30 check, and probably they say, okay, I will give you the check if this person shuts up. Okay? And then sometimes it works. But in more complex sales, in business to business, the more you push customers to buy, the less they will buy. Next slide, please. So what are some of the trends that we see before COVID, and actually they have become even worse with COVID? The first trend is that most business buyers are looking at actually reducing the number of suppliers rather than increasing the number of suppliers. So you knock on their doors, and the default answer that you get is, well, I don't need to listen to your presentation. I already have a preferred vendor. So that's trend number one. Trend number two, from the selling side, and this is driven also from the buyer side, most companies are relying on multiple channels, channels that may sometimes be more efficient. So think about, like, for instance, how we used to purchase airline tickets 30, 40 years ago. You would go basically to an agent. Okay? Same applies to insurance and to many other products. And then you would approach to a salesperson, and the salesperson would try to sell you a product, whatever that product is. Many of these processes can now be automated, and they're much more efficient. So now when we buy a ticket or when we buy insurance, it's much easier to go to www.insuranceofyourpreference.com, complete something in 5 minutes, and then very efficiently, very effectively complete the purchase. So the question is, why do you need a salesperson? There are many differences, even nowadays, on how sales processes work in the US and in South America. So one that comes to mind is, for instance, how we buy cars in the US and how we buy cars in many places in Latin America. So when you go to the US, how large is the typical dealership? It's measured in square feet or in acres? For those of us who live in Dallas-Fort Worth, it's in acres. You drive by I-20, and then you have these huge parking lots packed with cars. Okay? And then you get into the dealership, and immediately after, you will find the salesperson trying to persuade you to buy a car. And of course, is that salesperson doing this for free? I don't think so. They either directly or indirectly receive a commission. Now, if it's not the first time you buy a car, are you willing to pay $1,000 for the advice that you get from the salesperson on buying a car? If the question is not, then probably a better solution for that problem is, which is what you see in Europe and in many of the South American countries, is save the commission, or make it super simple so that the selection process and everything else is basically online. So when do you need salespeople? You need salespeople when they add value. In essence, there are two types of sales situations. Well, there are more than two. This is an oversimplification, but the two most common approaches for sales are referred to as transactional sales versus consultative sales. And we're going to talk about those two ways of selling. Can I have my next slide, please? So when do you need a salesperson? You need a salesperson when that salesperson adds value. If the salesperson is basically an order taker, in other words, customers call the company and then the salesperson reacts to that call and gives you some minimum guidance and then completes the purchase, you can automate that process, and that salesperson is not going to be needed. Next slide, please. So let's think about what salespeople really do. One of the best studies in sales was not written by sales researchers, but actually by an economist, George Acuff. So he wrote a paper in the 70s that is called The Market for Lemons. What Acuff did is he went out and looked at data, price data of cars over long periods. And, the question that he was asking was, let's say that you have two cars. Car number one is in great condition. You put it to tests and the car is very good, very reliable, no problem with it. Vehicle number two is in a bad condition. If a certified mechanic comes in, starts looking at the vehicle, and then looks at what the car has as problems, and then that mechanic will tell you, you better not buy that car because it will be a headache. So you have a very good car and a very bad car. What would you think the market price of those cars is? Is the better car worth more than the bad car? And we're talking about used cars. What do you think? I want an answer in the chat. What should the price be? Would the price be better than the not so good car? That's what you think? Well, what Acuff demonstrated is that both cars are sold at the same price. So why are both cars sold at the same price? The core of transactional sales and manipulative sales is on information asymmetry. So what does that mean? The buyer, when the buyer comes to a dealer and sees two used cars, the buyer cannot differentiate between the good car and the bad car unless that person is a certified mechanic. So what does the dealer do with the price of both cars? Puts them at the same level. Now, what the dealer is doing, and that's what Acuff demonstrates, is using information asymmetry. The only one that knows that the car is not that good is whom? The seller or the buyer? So, the seller. Does the buyer know that? No. So since the buyer doesn't know, what does the buyer do? Pay the higher price. Okay. Does that sound somewhat deceiving? Okay. So, strategies based on, pushing and information asymmetry get you short-term business. Okay. And of course, those strategies used to work in the 70s. Why? What is the worst case scenario if you were sold a lemon? You probably cried for some time, told your friends, but how many friends could you tell before the internet? Not too many. So businesses engaging in these somewhat deceptive practices could succeed. Why? Because of information asymmetry. So what was the number one role of the salesperson? Close the deal. Now, there is a deal breaker here, a fundamental shift on how sales is conducted now. Do we still have information asymmetry? Probably yes, but it's very, very small. Not as much. So now buyers, especially business buyers, sophisticated buyers, sometimes know more about products, prices, conditions than the salesperson. So the salesperson can no longer use information asymmetry to sell. Can I have my next slide? Okay. So back to value added. Let's think about consultative sales versus transactional sales. So in transactional sales, the buyer thinks that value comes from characteristics of the product. So let's say that you're going grocery shopping. And when I do grocery shopping, I come with a list that comes from my wife. So I have an order, and the list says something like, Fernando, go buy a gallon of milk. Do I need a salesperson to tell me and to persuade me about the advantages of calcium and how milk has calcium and how milk is good for me? Would that add value? Yes or no in the chat? No. So what is the best case scenario? I don't want to build a relationship with a salesperson. What do I need to do? What do I want as a client? Do I value the conversation with the salesperson? No. Do I value the conversation with the salesperson in the car dealership? You know? And like James says, you know, you better buy that milk, you know, regardless of, you know, the advice I get from the salesperson, of course. So in transactional selling, what do customers care about? I want to see that in the chat. What do you care about when you're buying products where all the value comes from the product itself? Paige is completely right. Price. Yeah, attributes like quality would be important. And what else? Okay, let's give Justin an A. You know, convenience. Price and convenience are the two most important attributes. Okay? It's kind of like when you're enrolled in a class. You know, some of them very boring. And the instructor tells you, you know, buy this textbook. Do you have a choice on the textbook? You know, even if you think that it's the most boring textbook, you have to buy it. So what do you care about? Price and convenience. Do you care about anything else? No. Do you care about the advice that the salesperson gives you? No. So for transactional sales, how do you need to design the sales process? Make it very convenient, make it very fast, okay, and price competitive. The less salespeople intervene, the better off you are. Now, let's shift for a minute. Let's shift to more complex sales. So what makes a sales complex? I need feedback from you on the chat. Let's think about business purchases. Okay, you know, Steve is, you know, right on track. You have too many options. And what happens with having too many options? When you have too many options, it's very difficult to choose. So when is it easy to choose? And I'm going to, you know, so that you remember this, I'm going to do a quasi-experiment here. You know, do any of you have small children at home? Nieces, nephews, small children. Okay. When you give them two options, you tell them, okay, Billy Joe, choose between these two things. And you give them, let's say, okay, a bicycle and, you know, something from the dollar store that they don't like. What would they choose? You know, probably the bicycle. But what happens when you give them two products that are somewhat equivalent? What do? They can't decide and ask for both. That's exactly what they do. And when you tell them, no, choose one, what do? They cry. Exactly right, Amber. They cry. Okay? For our brain, it's super difficult to choose when the brain cannot decide on which one is better. Okay? So now let me give you a marketing application of that. Is presenting too many choices for the customer a good sales tactic? Yes or no? Not very effective, especially when. So what is the condition that makes this particularly ineffective? Complexity. Complexity. So when it's super complex, what do we want from the salesperson? Guidance. Yes, keep it simple. Guidance. And guidance comes from, as Rachel says, perception of knowledge. You see the salesperson as knowledgeable. So what is the core of consultative sales? What is the salesperson providing as added value? Expert in problem solving. Is that okay? So it acts like a consultant. Okay. Now, let's get into some of the challenges that we face now with COVID. So typically, how are most sales calls done before COVID? You would go as a consultative salesperson and probably schedule a visit face-to-face with your client or with your prospect. Is that feasible now? I'm going to quote Jennifer. Nope. Or, really inconvenient, mask to mask. But in essence, we're moving towards what? Whether we like it or not, more virtual sales. Okay? Now, let's think about salespeople. Do most salespeople enjoy visiting customers and working from home? Okay? So all the empirical evidence that is coming from COVID overwhelmingly tells no. Leslie and Jorge and I, we collected some data with Chilean salespeople. And that was actually one of the questions we asked. And of course, everybody they were, answering that question and thinking that we're, just stupid. Why do you ask that question? Of course they prefer face-to-face. But they have to do, virtual sales because they have no choice. But that, can be very stressful on the salesperson. And even before COVID, we know that generates something that IO psychologists and, people in marketing as well, we call that workplace isolation. So what is this workplace isolation? You feel out of sight and out of mind. You are working, but it's kind of like strange working from home. Well, most of your adult life, you were working face-to-face or in an office. So you start having that strain that comes from, feeling out of sight and out of mind. You also have, and probably that happens to many of you now, we did a survey with UTA students and alumni and in the College of Business, our faculty, so forth and so on. And we had some open-ended questions about COVID. And one of the most frequent answers that we were getting, especially from students is that, faculty should not assume that we're sitting home watching Netflix movies. Most of us are super busy. And now we have to share the computer and the internet bandwidth, students, and all those kinds of things, and I feel less productive. And I feel that I'm always working. So when you have that feeling of always working, that you cannot disconnect from your job, what do you start facing? You start facing work-family conflict, family-work conflict, interpersonal conflict, and then you end up, like Rachel said, being burned out. So I'll tell you a 2-minute story involving my daughter. So I have 2 daughters. One is a teenager, 13-year-old that doesn't want to talk to me as much as she used to. But I have also a 9-year-old. And she sees me home, more than I used to be. So of course, when she sees me, she enters my room, she sees me in front of a computer, and then the first thing that, she tells me is, "Daddy, let's play." And of course, 9 out of 10 times I tell her, "No, I can't. I'm on this very important meeting. I'm giving this talk," or what have you. So of course, I can see the frustration on her face. And but then what is and I'm going to ask answer to that question of yours, Justin. But then what does she do then? She creates a Zoom account, and then I get an email popping up with an invitation for a Zoom meeting with my daughter who happens to be home. So I'm telling this story because that always working feeling that we get. You are home, but you're not really home. You're not engaging with home-like tasks. Of course, there are also positive things about working from home. Commuting and not having to go through Dallas traffic. Or in Chile, how do we call that? El taco. By the way, that's not Spanish, that's only Chilean Spanish. Which is basically, traffic. And you save some of that. That's why actually many companies are shifting, even before COVID, to having some component of virtual sales. Because employees save some of that commuting time. It allows for more time for completing sales jobs, sales tasks, like rather than being on the road. However, on average, most salespeople still prefer working in non-sales environments. Okay? So I'm going to start getting into some factors that relate with performance of salespeople in both virtual and non-virtual environments. I started with a question about, are salespeople made or are salespeople born? Besides how attractive you are or how tall you are, which is very difficult to change, there are some personality variables that are also related with salesperson performance. One of the most important is concern for self and concern for others. In the sales literature, we call that selling orientation versus customer orientation. And this concern for self and concern for others is a personality-like variable. What does that mean? It means that once you hit your 20s, unless there's a life-changing event, you're not going to change. So if you are wired internally to have a high level of concern for others, then regardless of the situation, you're going to be displaying customer-oriented behaviors. In other words, you're wired to try to serve your customer. If you have a very, very high level of concern for self, what does that mean? That it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't care about customers, but it means that you care very much about yourself. So what does it mean that you care about yourself? When you're selling a product and deep in your heart, that may or may not be a great fit for the customer, but that by selling that product, you're going to get a large commission. Do you complete the sale, yes or no? So I'm talking about a person with a high level of concern of self. Yes. And the person will say yes, Why? Because I need that paycheck. So salespeople now, Now, okay, show me the money. That's what Mr. Rivera and Justin is saying. When you talk to salespeople, won't they tell you also, well, I like what I'm doing, however, show me the money. So what do we see in effective salespeople? Is a high level of concern for self necessarily a bad thing? Yes or no? Should you hire salespeople that tell you, show me the money? No, except what? Except when they have also a low level of concern with others. Run away from them. However, if they have both a high level of concern for self and a high level of concern for others, actually top performing salespeople can leverage from both motivators. They care about others, but they care about themselves. And because they care about others and they care about themselves, I'm going to answer to Justin's comment about building relationships. They engage in behaviors that are consistent with relationship building. Does that make sense? So concern for self and concern for others is the personality wiring. But what really matters is not why you do it, but actually what you do, the behaviors. So both of these motivators influencing the behaviors that you're going to use to sell. Okay. Does that make sense? Now let's go back to this concern for self and concern for others. So one of the important drivers in virtual sales, salespeople report that what motivates them is doing something meaningful. They're motivated by doing something challenging. They tell, I want to do something that makes a difference for my customer. Let's think about the so-called demanding and difficult customers. So for people in the chat, have you interacted with demanding customers? Those who are a pain, they have very high expectations. You do something for them, it's your best work, and they tell you, well, you can improve, Fernando. Jacobia is saying, yes, I have dealt with those customers, those highly demanding customers. Top performing salespeople typically see those high demanding customers as challenging, as meaningful, and actually they see them as opportunities for growth. What do bottom performing salespeople see when they face a demanding customer? This is too much for me. Why did I get into sales? These customers are a headache, so forth and so on. One of the worst stressors for high-performing salespeople is actually boredom. Omar's comment, just find another customer with easy money. Well, in competitive markets, that is super difficult. Actually, that's a characteristic of bottom-performing salespeople. They try to find easy customers. And it happens that the easy customers, they're not sophisticated, but they also are not very attractive. They don't buy much. And that's why they're not, they don't know the business. Okay. In virtual sales, salespeople talk about, life satisfaction. So whenever you have some time and you're bored, try to read a book written by Csikszentmihalyi. So Csikszentmihalyi spent, many, many years studying life satisfaction. What makes people truly satisfied with life? On the chat, what do you think is the number one factor in explaining life satisfaction? So what makes you truly, and by the way, Justin, it's not money. No, so life satisfaction means happiness. It's a synonym, okay? Or it's highly related. And of course, it's not money. Life satisfaction comes from, the feeling of I accomplished something. So Csikszentmihalyi found that people report the highest level of satisfaction. They were like extremely satisfied after they climbed the mountain, after they completed the race, after they scored a difficult goal, after they earned a difficult business, something like that. So they feel accomplished. That is what truly, that is truly what explains life satisfaction. That feeling of I did something worthwhile doing. So let's take that back to virtual sales and COVID environment. How do you motivate your top performance? Give them challenges, not busy work. Make them feel that they can add value. Can I have my next slide, please? Okay. So what did we learn so far? Transactional versus consultative sales. So in transactional, it's all about price and convenience. In consultative sales, it's more about problem solving, okay? Adding value through solving problems. Now let's think about problem solving. So what does problem solving really mean? Who has the problem, the salesperson or the buyer? Of course, the buyer. So even if you're a very experienced salesperson, do you know the problem that the customer faces? No. So what is the first stage? What is the first thing that you need to do before trying to persuade someone to buy? Listen. Okay. And what does listening mean? Does listening mean that your eardrums are capturing the sound waves? What does listening mean? Listening means being proactive at listening. It means what? Asking questions. Asking a lot of questions to understand the problem the customer faces. And the second stage of listening is after you receive that information, what do you do with that information? You do something about it. So listening involves what? Receiving feedback and reacting to it. And listening has that empathetic component. So what is that empathetic component? Also show that you do this because you care. Okay? So remember that we were talking about concern for self and concern for others? Okay? For people who are wired to have a high level of concern for others, active empathetic listening comes naturally. Okay? Can I have my next slide, please? Okay. So let's get about, persuasion. How do you start persuading people? What are some of the things that you can do? So persuasion is an influence tactics, comes from, even the Greeks. The Greeks started these discussions. So basically, there are three known mechanisms for persuasion. The first one is rational persuasion. Okay? Using rational logical arguments. They come from informational exchanges, things like recommendations, so forth and so on. So, basing your presentation and using rational arguments in your presentation. But most sales are both rational and emotional, even in business to business. So sometimes you also have to, play the emotional aspect of sales. So what is the emotional aspect of sales? Make them feel at ease. Make them feel well. So the most persuasive presentation doesn't look like a boring academic presentation, like mine now. It looks like a dialogue. Very difficult to do that with a chat room, but that's the most effective presentation. A dialogue where people are smiling, are having fun, and are displaying positive emotions. Are any of you in the chat room married? Yes or no? I guess you have learned over time. Is it easy to persuade your significant other when that person is mad at you, displaying negative emotions? Happy wife, happy life. Okay. So when is it easy? If you want her to do something for you, the first thing you need to do is put it in a bad mood or in a good mood. In a good mood. So that's where the emotional aspect comes in. In order to be persuaded, buyers have to be in a good, positive mood. Third way of persuading, actually, not effective at all. The use of coercive influence tactics. Always be closing kind of advice. Use of promises, threats, and personal appeals. So let me go over that because I think, many of us have used those tactics without knowing that, very well. So you want your customer to buy, give them the last push. So what is our natural reaction? Make some promises. If you buy now, I'll give you a 5% discount or a 10% discount. Does that work? Well, short term it does, long term is a disaster. Because then they will go, if they give me 15. And the customer will soon learn that, the best objection that they can have is, okay, last time you gave me 15% discount, so now let's look for 20%. That's a characteristic of bottom performing salespeople. They go to the customer, and when their boss asks, why are you not meeting sales quotas? The first thing that comes to mind is, we're not price competitive. You need to give me, more, you have to give me more discretion on giving discounts for customers. They run away from those salespeople because they want to rely on promises. Even worse than promises, threats. If you don't buy from me, you're not going to be preferred customer anymore, and you lose your benefits, so forth and so on. What do we typically do with these salespeople? We see them as, pushy, doesn't care about me, so forth and so on. So we walk away from them. Salespeople, especially in business to consumer, and sometimes in B2B, they use personal appeals. So they will say, Steve, you know that you and I have been friends for over 10 years. I'm assuming that you're going to buy from me, aren't you, Steve? So how does Steve feel about that? You're trying to manipulate. So, do coercive influence tactics work? No, they don't. So avoid using them. Play with, actually, they can backfire. If you correlate that with performance, the effects that you're going to get are 0 or negative. Can I have a next slide, please? Okay. Now, rational and emotional. So, I'm Hispanic. So what is one of the stereotypes that we have about Hispanic salespeople? and Hispanics in general? We are too emotional, aren't we? Have you watched that, that TV show, Modern Family? How is Hispanic stereotyped? As very emotional. Of course, Omar is probably right as well. Very handsome as well. But one of the stereotypes is the emotional aspect. But another cultural factor related with Hispanic is something called Simpatia. So what is this Simpatia thing? By the way, that's a concept. Hispanics on average tend to be very friendly. They want to avoid conflict, and they want to be liked by others. So they tend, in general, to be very nice. They want to avoid hurting your feelings. Okay? So, question for the group. When I'm persuading customers, does Simpatia help me, or does it hinder persuasion? What do you think? So I'm trying to use both rational and emotional arguments. Does Simpatia help, or doesn't it help? So all of you are saying it helps. And you're saying it feels like a friend. Okay, so James is getting closer to it. Okay? It depends. Of course, it depends on the person you are and the seller you are. Like, let's say that you get a very, very large sample and you account for that. So what does it depends mean? Let's think about the 3 ways of persuading, okay? Which are what? Rational, emotional, or promises and threats. If you're using rational arguments, do you want to display your charm and Simpatia elements? Yes or no? No, you don't, because it's inconsistent. So when you're using rational arguments, what do you want to be perceived as? Knowledgeable. Is that okay? Not emotional, not very nice and simpatico, buddy and friendly. You want to be perceived as what? Knowledgeable. And you're using rational arguments. Okay? Now, what happens when you're using emotional arguments? When you're using emotional arguments and emotional persuasion, that is when you want to be as simpatico as you can. Okay? So what's the takeaway? You can show your sympathy, but it works when you're using emotional arguments. Is that okay? Can I move to my next slide, please? Now let's apply these concepts to, sales presentations. Can I have my next slide? Okay. So of course, you know that PowerPoints don't work. So why do we use PowerPoints? Large amounts of information standardized. So don't do that. Next slide, please. If you do that, what do people do? They fall asleep. Can I have my next slide? What do we typically do when we start a presentation? So let's say that I want you, to recruit you to, which by the way, it's part of my job, recruit you to UTA. And I start with something like you have in the PowerPoint. UTA's College of Business plays an essential role in providing an outstanding educational experience. We're located in the heart of Dallas-Fort Worth. We have an enrollment of 6,500 students. We're a Carnegie One school. We have awesome faculty that conduct blah, 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 blah. So what do you do when you start a presentation talking about how wonderful your company is? You put people to sleep. Next slide, please. So what do you do in your first seconds? Number one, before you speak, remember those, remember, even before you start breaking the ice, appearance. Especially for those of us who were not born very tall and handsome, then you have to do what? Dress professional. Be ready before the meeting, and that applies, to Hispanics as well. Look like you have your act together, okay? Organized, all those kinds of things, because the buyer is receiving messages from you even before you open your mouth, and then right after you open your mouth, the first seconds you tell who you are, who you represent, why you are there, and immediately you start building rapport. So what is this rapport about? It's about building, this connection with the buyer. Can I have my next slide? And then you do what? You talk about them, not us. And then you ask a bunch of questions, as many as you can. Next slide, please. And then you listen. Where do you listen? On the active empathetic side. In other words, you engage in an action. Can I have my next slide? And then you talk about problems that the customer has. Which problems? The important ones. No problem, no sales. Business buyers are only willing to buy from you when they see a problem. The default is no change. We're comfortable with no change. And selling something involves a change. So that only happens when the client realizes that they face a problem. Next slide, please. Only when you understand your product, your problem from the client, the customer, the buyer, then you talk about your product. And then one technique that people like Steve Jobs, actually there's a book that has been written on that. When doing these presentations, you want to talk about no more than 3 attributes. Make it simple and tie those attributes back to the problem. What this means to you in terms of the problem. So you provide that solution based on the problem that the customers have. Next slide, please. Of course, they will tell you no many times. Rule of thumb there is what? Number 1, objections are the best thing that happens to you. So when do people participate and object? When they care or when they don't care? When we don't care, what do? We don't do anything. Okay, so objections are a sign that they care. Customers use objections as a mean of what? I'm hearing, now I'm negotiating. So you address the objections, and we don't have time for going to the many objections that you have. Next slide, please. So after the objections, you're close to minute 10. So what do you do in your last 2 minutes? Next slide, please. You pre-close. So you make sure that the prospect understands why they're buying the product, what the product is going to do, and actually how the product will help them address problems. If you look at distribution of complaints, it's a bimodal distribution. So most complaints occur right after we purchase and when the product is achieving obsolescence. Okay? So the first hump in objections, means that the salesperson didn't do a good job in pre-closing. expectations were not clearly communicated. And after that, what do? Next slide, please. You close. Now, who closes? You or the customer? I want an answer in the chat room. What most effective salespeople do is have the customer give them cues for closing. It's the customer who closes. The customer gives you signs that he or she is ready. So that advice that we started this presentation, always be closing, is really bad advice. The one who closes is actually the customer. Next slide, please. Of all the things that I have told you, the number one differentiator between top performing salespeople and bottom performing salespeople is follow-up. Top performing salespeople excel at follow-up. Think like a customer. And I'm going to use an analogy to marriage. And for those of you who are not married, this is, why you should reconsider. So typically what happens before marriage? Both parties put their best face or their worst face. I want to see an answer in the chat room. The best face. So we're all very nice. We take our significant other, to dinner, open the door of the car, all these wonderful things. And then what happens sometimes after marriage? Then the behavior changes. So my wife still complains about that. She starts with, when we were dating, and then I know that the story comes. We used to go out more, so forth and so on. The real comes out. Kids, soccer, all those kinds of things. Now, what is the most important part in this relationship? The before marriage or the after marriage? In the eyes of the customer, the relationship begins after closing in follow-up. Before closing, you were just making promises. After closing is when you realize that actually those promises are going to be honored. How much time do we have? So top performing people excel in follow-up, in delivery. Marketing 101, under promise, over deliver. What do bottom salespeople do? Over promise, under deliver. So bottom performing salespeople have to find new victims all the time. What do top performing people have to do? They get most of their business from where? Existing clients and word of mouth. Next slide, please. So, final ideas. There is some interesting work about how business buyers perceive salespeople. They put them in 4 levels, depending on how much value they add. Level number 1, they call them the walking brochure. So who is the walking brochure? How do they start the presentation? They basically read the PowerPoint or the catalog for the company. They talk about the product. What do customers do with them? They shoo them. They add no value. You're going to be a walking brochure. You just post the brochure on the internet. Next slide, please. Salesperson number 2. Who is salesperson number 2? Remember the one that, every time you talk about, price, and you tell them, yeah, your price is too high, I might need a discount, and they start giving you discounts? That is level 2. So why do you keep that salesperson card? Because you can get sometimes good deals from that salesperson. Now, who pays for those deals? Typically the company. And actually sophisticated buyers, what do? They ask them, to present offers. And what do they do with those offers? They go to the preferred vendors to get another discount. So level 2 salespeople are typically used by buyers. Next slide, please. Level 3. So level 3 are those that engage in some consultative sales. So what do? We learned that, number 1, they try to solve problems. They listen. Number 2, the solution that they provide is integrated. So it's integrated to what the company already has. So if they're selling photocopy machines, they also have to integrate with whatever software you're using. They're not just selling a product, they're selling an integrated solution. Next slide, please. When they are good at doing that, and they do it on a consistent basis, they become the so-called trusted advisor. Because that's what trust means, almost by definition. Trust means what? That you're making promises and you're honoring those promises. That's the first component. And the second component is that you're doing that because you care. So what type of salespeople do you want to hire and promote and keep in your company? Those who are willing to honor the promises, those who care about the customer, those who are willing to listen, and those who excel in follow-up. And by the way, these salespeople typically don't do well short-term. Why? Because when they approach customers, they tend to tell the truth and they don't present a rosy picture. So sometimes they lose business. But over time, what happens? The slope at what they sell is positive and permanent over time. So over time, they become top because they build that trust with salespeople. Very, very important, especially when things are not going well. Like when you have a shock, like COVID. Under these situations, dealing with someone you trust becomes even more important than under normal circumstances. So, any questions that you have as a group? No more questions? Well, it's been a pleasure talking to this wonderful group in both Chile and the US and our own EMBA students. I hope some of these concepts were useful to you. And in the chat room, I'm going to write my email here. So if you ever need something from me, and of course the chat function is not working for me. Let me see.
Okay. Thank you, Fernando, for your presentation. Very, very interesting, and for your attention. So, and thank you for the audience, for the participation and the comments. And take care. See you soon.
Thank you all and have a great rest of the day.
Okay. It's very nice.
So if you want to reach out to me, I was going to put in the chat room my email address, but I can't do it for some reason. Doesn't let me. I don't think I can do that. But for the Chilean students, you can get them through Leslie. And for our EMBA students, you know how to find me. And if not, ask Nancy or Joseph. And we can continue these discussions if you want something for your company that relates to sales.
Yeah. Caramillo.
Thank you, Abdul, for inviting me to speak to your group as well. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye. Bye.